All right, let's go ahead and get started. Again, thanks to the first panel for solving the AI dilemma for us, and now we'll solve another equally complicated one on federal policy. So we had a hard time naming this session. The emerging federal landscape, the new federal landscape, the chaotic federal landscape. We weren't quite sure what to call it, but we just stuck with keeping it simple and the new federal landscape. So I'm delighted that Marshall Macomber has agreed to chair the panel. Marshall, as many of you know, has recently become the chief of Maryland DOT's Office of Innovative Finance and Delivery, and many of you may know him from his role for many years at AIAI, the Association for Investment in American Infrastructure, and at the House of Representatives before that. Seth Miller-Gabriel, who was supposed to be on our panel, had to cancel at the last minute, and happily Baruch Feigenbaum from Reason Foundation has agreed to step in. So thank you, Baruch, for stepping in. And I will, without further ado, turn it over to Marshall and the panel and look forward to hearing what you got to tell us. So thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and good morning to everybody here. And I just want to give a shout out here to Jonathan for his leadership and for GMU and all the work you all have done through the years. Thank you for keeping this forum up. Let's give him a round of applause, as always. Well, this is an important forum, and it's a great privilege to always be a part of this thing. So thanks to this, and thanks for everybody who's here and all the students and those who are joining us today. Yes, for an interesting panel. What do we call it, Jonathan? The P3s in the new federal landscape. Marshall Macomber, now chief of the Office of Innovative Finance and Delivery at Maryland Department of Transportation. Let me let my colleagues, Tom and Baruch, introduce themselves. I'll say a few comments, then we'll get to it. Tom.
All right, morning, everybody. Tom Curtin, Senior Policy Advisor with Meridium. Meridium is a international P3 developer, project developer, financer. We work across transportation, energy, and social infrastructure. And we've got a couple dozen projects here in the U.S. and a little over 100 throughout the rest of the world. So happy to be here. And
Yeah, Baruch Feigenbaum, a Senior Managing Director of Transportation Policy at Reason Foundation. And Reason Foundation is a 501c3 think tank. In addition to transportation, we have other policy areas, education, pensions, technology, et cetera.
Baruch just testified in front of T&I, correct?
Yes, I did.
Yes?
Yes. Oh, I guess I'm supposed to elaborate. Okay.
Yeah, we'll get to it.
Yes or no question.
Yeah, the answer, that was a yes, yes. You say yes, yes. And so he'll provide lots of insight there. Let me do my part here and throw out some great, cool stuff about the state of which I now serve and work for, the state of Maryland. I also have my colleague Caleb Weiss over here, who works with me out there at TSO in Hanover. Come see us, come talk to us. We're thrilled to be there. State of Maryland, a really cool place, and MDOT on top of that, a really interesting place. If you're not familiar with, first of all, Marylanders here, and thank you to our friends and colleagues from VDOT and here in the Commonwealth for having us on this side of the Potomac. We very much appreciate it, and look to you for all the great work you all have done over here. Thank you for that. Maryland, really interesting place. And if you're familiar with MDOT, it's a little different from VDOT in many ways. Vertically integrated across, Caleb, 6 modes. If we included our toll authority, we're very familiar with things like tolls and user fees. We've got a bunch of bridges and tunnels across the state with our toll authority, as I said. We're doing transit. We're doing commuter rail. We're doing highways. We're doing our port. We're doing interesting big projects all over the place. We have our motor vehicle administration, of course. I think I've missed and MAA. We have not just BWI. Who's been to Martin State Airfield? Anybody here? Martin State, maybe Mark Paulson's flown his private jet out of Martin State Airfield over there. Yeah, well, or maybe Deborah Brown has, perhaps. It's a fascinating entity, the Department of Transportation in Maryland, and we've got a lot of cool things. From a P3 perspective, just let me put this out there. Those of you who drive north on I-95 heading up to Delaware or coming down from New York City, you'll notice both the Chesapeake House and the Maryland House. Those are P3 projects up there, long-term concession. I think 20, 30 years on those. They were new facilities when constructed, and there's a performance contract and entities that manage that for the state over the term. Kind of moving south, the others here we've got at the Port of Baltimore. Our Seagirt Marine Terminal, which is a long-term P3, I think it's 50 years with Ports America, there to help get containers off ships, onto rail and trucks, and off to America in many ways. And of course, there's another project you might have heard about called the Purple Line. We are over 75% complete on that project. It's going to connect Bethesda over to New Carrollton, Tom, I think New Carrollton, Maryland. It's going to be a terrific project. We're already under what we call dynamic testing, which means things are moving. The actual rail cars are moving along the rails. A long-term P3 DBFOM availability format, transit P3 in this country. For the students in the room, it's a very interesting project, one to look at. There's a lot of great stories and a lot of great things that have come from it and will continue to come from it. And then now we currently also have on the market, well, it's sort of on the market, we have an RFI out for our freight rail P3, which are 3 branch lines, freight rail branch lines on the eastern shore, which is the other side if you cross the Chesapeake Bay Bridge. 3 lines over there. We're working to grow those economies on Maryland's eastern shore, primarily ag-based. But we're trying to get the contract expires at the end of the year, and we're going to market to compete that contract under a long-term, possibly 40-year concession for that project as well. Interesting thing. We've also got in the state, not MDOT, but courthouses and schools, and also we've got stormwater P3s. It's a very, very interesting state. Virginia's very interesting too, of course. But I think in both sides of Potomac, Jonathan then speaks the importance of this conference here. This region has a lot going on, and we're not even talking about the district with streetlights and that type of thing. So I think kind of with that table setting, yes, panelists, it's 2025. We have a new administration. We have a Congress that is out there that wants to do lots of different things. As we speak, that tax reconciliation bill is making its way over through the House of Representatives. You all who are listening or watching back in 2017, it's a similar process so far. There potentially may be some infrastructure provisions in that. Later, we're starting the process now, but into 2026, and Baruch can speak to this as well, with the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, the IIJA, coming to the end of its term, so to speak. We have a reauthorization, perhaps not of that bill, but of highway programs that is going to start. Congress is busy getting feedback from stakeholders. If you haven't given your feedback, you should. And then, of course, things like Inflation Reduction Act, as we're seeing related here, important in the world of infrastructure, especially for energy infrastructure. University of Maryland, we have a next-gen energy campus energy project on the University of Maryland campus. I see plenaries very much involved in that project. Used some of the tax credits as part of the capital structure, the financing structure for that project. It's a very interesting thing going on at University of Maryland campus. So a district energy project. So again, a lot going on here. And so I guess I turn to my panelists, and Tom, maybe we'll start with you. We're looking forward here with so much going on the Hill and a new administration, priorities. Is this a big year for infrastructure and P3? Is more of an incremental year? What are your thoughts?
No, I think thanks for that great introduction too. And a couple of things that I'd add onto that are the CHIPS and Science Act, which is another big thing that is being implemented all across the states, and some of the other initiatives. But is this a big year? Yeah, I think it's definitely a big year. It's a great kind of table-setting year, and it's an opportunity to take stock of what's working, maybe what's not. You talked about the Hill getting ready to work on reauthorization. They're kind of in the middle of the reconciliation package on tax policy, which is potentially going to include a few things here or there that might impact the P3 space when it comes to private activity bonds and some of the other things that they're talking about. But I think it's a really good opportunity to see what worked, what went well under IIJA. So, we're 4 years in. We've got a year left. The Biden administration spent a lot of time hurrying to get dollars out the door and into the states and hoping that a lot of these projects would kind of get moving. And I think that they did. There were some stumbling blocks along the way. We saw inflation. We saw construction costs rising. We saw labor shortage issues. We saw a few other things. We saw kind of this push and pull between some interests that kind of didn't want to be left out of the process when it came to building a lot of these things. That may have kind of slowed things down a little bit, but there's a lot of momentum and a lot of eagerness out there to move things along. So where that kind of connects with the P3 space is, as we've seen this new administration take over and things like discretionary grants kind of slowing down a little bit, some of this uncertainty around federal funding, the appetite and the momentum is still there on the ground. The dollars are starting to slow a little bit out of DC, and I don't know that the outlook for a whole big package with a huge dollar value on it is very high. I don't know if that optimism is very high, but I think that's a perfect space for P3s to operate, because P3s can solve two things. They can solve that long-term funding and finance gap with creative solutions on that front, and the speed gap, because that momentum is there, and you've got a lot of folks ready to go and ready to invest and get in and roll up their sleeves with these state DOTs, local governments. So I don't know. I think it's going to be a big year.
Yeah. Baruch, what do you think about that? Big year, medium year, small year?
Yeah, I agree that it's a big year to maybe set up next year, if that makes sense. I look at the Surface Transportation Reauthorization Bill, and as you mentioned, I was fortunate enough to testify, and Congress is holding these hearings basically now to sort of set the stage for what they're going to do. So they're having one per mode, which they're basically finished with, and of course they're dealing with some air traffic control issues right now, which is another interesting issue. But what I heard, let me start with what I heard in the transit room from the representatives in the room. So crime continues to be a big issue on transit that I never thought before COVID it was an issue. Personally, I thought it was an excuse, but I think now it is. When we looked at some of the LA Metro numbers, we were seeing a violent crime occurring on their system once every other week, which is just not acceptable to riders last year anyway, the year we have numbers for. So that was an issue. The number of discretionary grant programs is an issue, not just in transit, but in highways and everywhere. I did an analysis, and I was able to find 101 different discretionary grant programs in the IIJA, and I may have missed some. And that just becomes not realistic because, first of all, there's all these different, you got to figure out which program you want to apply for. If you're a small agency, you have limited resources. You can't apply for many of them. Some of them are, in my opinion, outside the realm of what transportation should be doing anyway. And so I think there's bipartisan support in the next bill to rein those programs in. I think you're going to see far fewer. I recommended one per mode. I don't know that we'll be there, but it's going to be a lot less than that. I also think with this administration, you're going to see more of an emphasis on highways. Now, Congress obviously can do its own thing, but with Republican support in Congress, I think that's where, Chairman Graves wants to go. And I think that's by and large where the Senate wants to go as well. And then on top of that, I think you see an appetite to do things, but I worry that maybe we're not necessarily, from the administration's point of view, necessarily thinking through everything that we're doing. And so there might be some unintended consequences that are not even what they want. And so it's important to get things done, but it's important to get things right. And so thinking things through is going to be really important, and that's probably going to be more the role of Congress, I believe.
So let's build on, and maybe you both were kind of getting at, maybe looking back, what worked, what didn't. So we're here in a P3 audience here, and coming off, by the way, a fascinating discussion on AI. Thank you to all the panelists on that previous discussion. Really important, and I think one we need to build on here as well. So maybe we'll try to incorporate here AI to build on that as well. What worked, what didn't from a P3 perspective? Tom, from the developer's view, maybe start there.
Yeah, it was interesting. There was a strange thing that happened right at the beginning of IIJA, and we were kind of, everybody was leaning in. And my previous role, I've been at Meridian for about 4 or 5 months now, and previously was with the National Governors Association. So I was working with all the governors, infrastructure coordinators, kind of standing up plans and implementation, and working closely with the White House on that. And as soon as those dollars started coming, there was a school of thought that kind of said, well, you know what, we're good actually. We don't need any of these P3s anymore. We don't need private finance. We don't need to augment this with anything else. We're fine. We're going to be set. And there was another school of thought that was, okay, well, why don't we leverage the dollars that we have to create more opportunity? My personal opinion on this was that you kind of invest in P3s and big projects and grow your portfolio when you're flush, rather than as an option of last resort. I think we saw a few too many in the first camp. And so some projects that were kind of set to go as P3s were pulled back a little bit and said, oh, you know what, maybe we don't need to do that now. We can do that with all these federal dollars. And that didn't come as quickly and as robustly as people, I think, thought, because we ran into, as I mentioned, inflation, construction costs rising, labor shortages, things like that were still kind of lingering from COVID. So it didn't really kind of pan out as much. And now you've got some folks kind of coming back to that saying, all right, well, now we need that a little bit more. So, I think we've got, Brooke mentioned an appetite to do things. I think we've got an appetite to do things that I think is very, very prevalent and present on the ground. But there's also an imperative to do things now because, these infrastructure systems are aging. That's not stopping. The deferred maintenance that we were back here in Washington 5 years ago talking about is still present. And there's a lot of momentum. The other thing happening, right? It's Infrastructure Week right now, right? There's a larger conversation happening. This is part of it, where there is this momentum from a lot of different interests in pushing forward on some infrastructure solutions. And so, I think there's a real imperative to do that. Now, where I connect that with the P3 space is, we kind of can't keep coming back to Washington every few years with an emergency of things we didn't invest in. And, one thing I don't see in a P3 is deferred maintenance. If you're investing in 30 years, you're investing in something that's not going to be deferred, that's not going to be underinvested in, that is going to keep to a high standard over the course of that term. So you don't have to keep coming back to repair the things that you didn't fix over the last, couple of decades, which I think is going to make for a better pitch here in Washington in future infrastructure weeks if we
It's going to make a big role. I agree. It's make a big role for AI in managing these contracts.
I'm sorry. Was the question about AI? I think I missed
I know.
that part.
See, I got it in there.
I need AI.
I got it in there. I got the Baruch, what do you think? What worked? What didn't?
Yeah. So I would look at, I tend to agree that many entities, when they see a lot of money, think that they can do it without P3s, which I think is a very foolish. And so to the extent that things were slowed down with inflation and gridlock and whatever, that probably helped P3s, although we probably don't want that as the plan. We'd probably like P3s without the slowdown, with people going to them. I don't know, maybe that means we need to dial it back a bit on some of the funding. It's just my opinion. But I would say two things. One big advantage was private activity bonds being increased to $30 billion. I think that's really key. We are now reaching the sort of height of that, and so we're going to need to have this discussion. It seems like we always have the discussion of how much to increase it or whether to uncap it, and what's politically feasible. And uncapping it would be much better, because we don't have caps on most of the other tools that we use. We only have a cap here because when we first introduced private activity bonds, they were unknown. There was some political opposition, but we're past that. So to the effect that we can uncap it, that would be good in the future bill. But for this bill, the $30 billion was critical. The expansion, or the changes in TIFIA, I should say, were a little bit more challenging. There was a lot of expansions for transit-oriented development, land use type projects, and I think those projects are important, but I'm not sure TIFIA is the right instrument to be funding them. And I think we have to be careful because of the way these types of programs are counted against debt and such. We're only going to get a certain amount, and so we need to prioritize it. And so for the next bill, maybe we tighten up the eligibility a little bit. There was also, it used to be, investment grade rating from 2 of 3, I believe, and that was actually lowered to 1 of 3, which I think is a negative because we want the best projects. We don't want projects that are going to default on loans, frankly. So.
Yeah, Tom?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that careful is the right word there, and I'm hearing the same thing from the Hill. Is kind of right-sizing TIFIA, I think, is the phrase that.
Well, they did pass a bill, right, the end of Congress with WRDA,
Right.
to speak to some of that.
So, yeah,
and that's,
so that
that's
was
another
a-
question. Is that an issue as a developer?
I don't think so immediately. I think that, that was kind of a way that the DOTs saw as fixing some ongoing issues with August redistribution, which is a complicated process I'm not going to try to explain. Maybe Baruch understands it like a little bit more than I do. But, to kind of round out some of that contract authority and ability to utilize dollars that were otherwise unutilized at the end of various fiscal years that were snowballing into a big giant thing. So then they kind of swept some unused TIFIA authorization into a fix for that issue. But I think on the applicability to TIFIA to these other projects, I think we're seeing some kind of reticence in the majority side, at least in EPW and elsewhere, to kind of narrow that scope a little bit. But, Baruch mentioned PABs also, which I think private activity bonds have been just wildly successful. Going back to one of Marshall's earlier questions, I mean, that increase to $30 billion, that cap is going to be hit in the next, 9 months or so, maybe, if it takes that long. So managed lanes projects have been going kind of gangbusters. Those have been wildly successful. We see it here with I-66, SR 400 down in Georgia. We've got Tennessee. Looking at additional managed lanes, other states like North Carolina, I think are going to be really positive on the horizon. And, that's utilizing the tools. That's the state kind of utilizing the tools at their disposal to move things forward and move them forward quickly. So hopefully we can get maybe an increase in that PABS allocation or something to continue that trend. But I'll kind of ask, Marshall a question too. How are you guys thinking about things like this in Maryland when it comes to looking at the portfolio?
No, I'm the moderator. I get to ask the questions here, Tom, and I'll kind of wrap in some of my comments here. Because what I want to do, we think.
Had to try.
I know. We think across the enterprise, which kind of actually, Tom, gets to our next point, not about AI here, but maybe I'm looking at Jonathan back there of the Center for Infrastructure Public-Private Partnerships, not to take away from kind of the work that's happened here in the Commonwealth, primarily on managed lanes, at least in Northern Virginia. But in other sectors, let's talk about FAA. Of course, the tragedy we saw at DCA. We're seeing what's going on at Newark on a daily basis, and I want to get our studio audience here involved in the discussion as well. Does the focus, for example, in the airport space on FAA, of course, FAA reform has been batted around for years and years and years and years, various models, we've seen all this, who knows how that'll come out. But at the end of the day, is the focus on, for better or for worse, aviation? Does that move the needle for this market for innovation or alternative delivery and finance, say, in the airport space?
I mean, nothing. I don't know. Baruch might have a little bit more insight. All I'm hearing from US DOT is that there's a huge, almost not I don't want to say exclusive to speak for them, but I mean there is an overwhelming focus on FAA right now and on aviation, which I think has a very real urgency behind it.
Baruch, does it help or hurt?
It's complicated. I'm gonna try to do this in like 3 minutes, but we'll see. So basically, there are a lot of challenges in the aviation space. One of them is that airports have a limit on the passenger facility charges, which they can't raise. It's one of the big revenue sources, and so that's always a big thing. Now, that not being able to raise maybe introduces some P3 opportunities, but there are other challenges because right now the air traffic control debate, what the administration's proposal is they want to spend a lot of money on buildings and deferred maintenance and making sure that Newark Airport is actually functional, which is fine, but the problem is they're not fixing the underlying structural problems of how they got in this space. And so we, among many others, a coalition, looked at it and looked at spinning off air traffic control into a nonprofit corporatization, which is how every other except one developed country does it, which would solve some of those problems. But if you're looking at the airfield issues, maybe we're talking about some type of use of some type of private activity bonds there. Maybe we're looking at some type of airport TIFIA, just like we have a WIFIA in the water resources one. There's just not the same level of, I don't want to say creativity, but I'm going to say creativity in the airport space, I think, that I see in surface transportation. And so it tends to be more, we need more money, and if we don't get it this way, well, we just can't expand or we can't do it. And that is what has led to the deferred maintenance problems.
If I, what I'm finding as I dive more into the airport space as well is you've got so many competing interests. I mean, you see this between modes at MDOT all the time, and with BWI and Marshall and the rest of the municipal airports. You've got at every airport a ton of different priorities that can compete with each other. And this is one of those issues that is critically important, that everything kind of fits the right way, and that the things that people need to concentrate on are the things that they're concentrating on. And that's kind of one of the themes of a P3 as well. And
It always starts with safety at the airport.
And that's the thing.
Override, as it should be.
Right, because that's their focus, running the airport and safety. And so two things that where I've seen P3s be successful and kind of alleviate some of those competing pressures so that airport administrators can focus on administering the airport are on these terminal reconstruction projects, which we just finished a brilliant one up in LaGuardia that I think has been a model for P3 success in the airport space. And these consolidated rental car centers. I was just at a CONRAC conference down in Nashville, which is a thing. There are CONRAC conferences. It's a whole industry. You've got the car rental
Jonathan, that's
agencies.
next year's theme.
Yeah.
It's the CONRAC conference.
Consolidated rental car centers.
Who would have
Which,
known?
and I went down there having rented a car previously.
Okay.
So I was set. But I learned a lot about this because you've got, similar to the airside portion of the airports, is you've got a lot of kind of competitors out there in the field with these rental car agencies, rental car companies. And you've got the airport that wants to have a smooth customer experience. And you've got a customer facility charge that usually is what funds these projects. And it's something that the airport has as a competing interest that is also mixed in there with safety and everything else that they have to do.
Say that statement. The airport has as a competing interest. Say those words again, and what do you mean by that? It's very interesting.
Yeah, so
Say that again. What does that mean?
The airport has a variety of things that they need to invest in to make sure that the customer has a great experience when they're coming in and out of the terminal. And if you've got an aging, everybody knows, if everybody's rented a car will remember if it's a really positive experience or a not positive experience, which is just awful. So,
Are you suggesting having these competing interests is helpful
in the
on the overall enterprise of a particular airport?
What I'm saying is that those competing interests, moving one of them over to a P3 so that you don't have to worry about it, alleviates your pressures so that you can concentrate on the things that you need to concentrate on.
Interesting point.
Kind of everybody doing what they're best at is.
Yeah, and I would agree that the rental car space and especially terminals are the big opportunities. I would say that, airports want parking revenue, but they don't necessarily want people parking, so that's interesting. And the airlines have a big say in the terminals. So if you're going to be redeveloping a terminal, you have to get the largest airport or the largest airline to actually say yes to that. So that's another challenge. That might be something that could be changed in a future bill.
But they'll always be there to offer their thoughts and opinions as well, no matter what you put in law.
Oh, yes.
Yes, which gets at other things from the previous panel about trying to find around the world the data that underscores a lot of these the projects in a very specialized space like airports. It's hard to find. Gidi was getting at that. I think that's kind of one of the points of your enterprise there. Transitioning now over to another one, ports. For example, we've got a massive focus on the port, especially the port of Baltimore in Maryland, of course. We'll be rebuilding the Key Bridge here in the next several years, 2 or 3 years, we hope. Ports. We've had a focus on FAA. Does the focus on ports and commerce, does that move the needle from a policy perspective on the Hill?
Yeah,
I mean, again, another area of huge opportunity. And you guys have harnessed that really well in Maryland with the Seeger P3. I think that there's great opportunities for energy P3s at ports to hit different sustainable energy goals, transitioning into different fuels for drayage and things like that. Again, not a core function necessarily that a port director is thinking about how to operate every single day. But something that you bring in somebody who's been doing that and who is best at it, you can really move the needle on some of the broader goals that you have, whether it's, broader port, regional, state climate agendas. You can utilize some of those investments as a P3 there and focus on getting cans in and out of the port.
And ports, are we going to see ports as part of this debate? I mean, the FAA reauthorization already went through, so that's also kind of the legislative blocking and tackling. That's going to be the challenge of getting more resources or innovation in that space. Ports, Baruch?
Well, I think ports will be part of WRDA, but WRDA is reauthorized every 2 years, so it's coming up, regardless of whether it's wrapped in here. I will say, well, first of all, I just have to say with all of these positive Maryland comments that I agree with your first one, that Maryland is very interesting from a Virginia resident. I totally agree.
It is.
Anyway.
And Virginia's very interesting, too.
Full disclosure, we're outnumbering you up here because I'm an MDOT alum, so apologies.
That's fine. That's fine. I would note that one of the challenges for P3s for ports is that the port will get reimbursed by the federal government eventually. Often it's in the form of an earmark or something else. So when the Port of Savannah was widening or deepening its channel from 42 to 47 or something along those lines, I tried pitching them on a P3, much along some of the things that Maryland and Virginia had done. And their response was basically, if we're going to get the money, why should we do it? And so my response, which will not be popular with the ports, is that maybe we need to look at doing away with this mandatory funding if a P3 could do it cheaper and quicker. And we knew it could do it quicker just because it didn't have to go through all of the Army Corps review processes. So I'd like to see them look at that.
You know what it is too? I'll throw out a little twist on there too, and it can apply to kind of other infrastructure around the port other than the dredging and the deepening. But we've got a tunnel down in the Port of Miami that basically, if you're unfamiliar with the Port of Miami is an island in the bay there, and previously all truck traffic would come out of the port and go into downtown Miami and was basically choking the city. So they needed something to alleviate that pressure. And Meridian came in with this tunnel project and invested in this tunnel that's been open now for, I think, 12 years and has completely transformed the city of Miami. And somebody was telling me the other day, actually a dredging guy, was saying that it allowed Miami to be Miami again because it put all that traffic where it belonged, and that surrounding infrastructure allowed the port to grow and allowed the port to develop. So by having a P3 partner in there to do something port adjacent to alleviate some of those pressures, it allows that whole enterprise to grow.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great example, sort of the surface transportation infrastructure to the ports. And as the ports grow, not having that traffic in local neighborhoods is a big sell. And the P3 availability payments, I don't know that we want to toll them because that might encourage them to take another route. But a P3 availability payment is big. I will say that
there's no toll on that.
There's no toll. Yes, I will say.
I'm supposed to say that. I have to say that.
Okay. I will. Yeah.
There's no toll on that.
Yeah. The Port of New Orleans for a new expansion is actually looking. There's a couple of state representatives looking at similar to what the Port of Miami did to connect to I-10, so there's less effect in the neighborhood. So we may have a second example of that.
Questions from our studio audience here today. Any questions? If you don't, think of one, because you got to be next. Yes, sir. Either way. You probably don't need it.
Struck a little bit by the humor of this session and the previous session where they talked about the immense need for data. And I look at what we have done historically. The Federal Highway Administration, Federal Transit Administration produced a condition and performance report for the Congress. AASHTO would take that report and produce the bottom line report, which took the federal data and put dollars on it specifically and saying, we need this much. That totally disappeared in IIJA. You came through the whole period of COVID, since that the last data set we had to get through COVID, which was the most dramatic infrastructure event since World War II, was 2016 data out of FHWA and transit. Absolutely a pathetic situation, and the Congress did not seem. It's supposed to be a report every 2 years, and the Congress is supposed to make sure and call us up, as I often did, and testify. And nobody has said anything to anybody about it, the White House, the Congress, or anybody else. And I think we should, as a profession, be immensely embarrassed by the fact that quantification has kind of lost interest.
Baruch, maybe any thoughts there?
Yeah, I totally agree with what Alan is saying. I will say, I think I can say this, we prepared some recommendations for Congress in terms of what we would, from our perspective, like to see in the next surface transportation bill, and that was on it. I have to say, I'm a graduate of Georgia Tech, so that's, I guess, neither Virginia nor Maryland. But we had a quantitative approach to transportation, and in the real world, not so much. And the data sources, I think, compared to some other, other spaces, are really lacking. Both at the federal. I mean, there's some good data in the private sector, which is expensive, but even it's kind of piecemeal. More of a focus on data is really needed.
Yeah, I'll kind of double down on that a little bit and zooming back out to the way that we invest in infrastructure. We're asking our infrastructure to do a lot more today than we asked it to do when we invested in it in the past. And we're asking our infrastructure to make an impact on communities, on neighborhoods, on societal challenges, and advance a whole variety of policy goals that will in turn reshape our communities a little bit. So we've got this opportunity with everything that we talked about on the previous panel and all the technologies that we're investing in while we're out building this new infrastructure to solve new problems and solve today's problems and tomorrow's problems, and in a lot of cases, yesterday's problems. So, I kind of want to throw this out there to the whole kind of group as well when we think about how we operate together between state, local, and private sector, and how are we going to work together to solve some of these challenges? Because having conversations like this and getting in a room, I mean, when I was at MDOT, I would just kind of call people up in the private sector and say, hey, this is what I'm thinking about. I know you've done this in Texas or in California or in Australia or somewhere, and say, how did you do this? How are you working on it? And kind of getting that feedback loop, because, on the private sector side, we need it as well. What are the goals? What are the policy agendas? What are you trying to accomplish? Having that feedback and continuous conversation, I think this forum is really good for things like that. And having that kind of built in with all the tools that we have at our disposal. I mean, I think, to your point, it would be a shame if we didn't do that, because it would be a real missed opportunity.
And, I would build on that about the feedback tool. I agree, between the agency owner, wherever that is, and the private sector developer, in this case, investor. I would also say MDOT, Virginia, both do a really good job, I think, talking to their communities. Because if we aren't talking to our communities about these ideas, I could sit there in the office all day and think, hey, this would be a great idea, let's try this. But we ultimately have to talk to our communities to make sure that it is also their wish and intent as well to solve, I think you're right, the many, many objectives, rightfully or wrongly, that I think people expect, Brooke.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I feel like I've been a little negative here, so saying something positive, I do think this is something that P3 concessionaires do well, because they need to. They need to have that data. You're not going to make a 50-year decision if you don't have some idea of what's happening. And so maybe we need to push, the federal government especially, to sort of get with the program, because while I think this is a good place for P3s, I also think we need better data across the spectrum.
I was about to say, and what is the policy point on this? And just a quick build for Maryland and our colleagues in Prince George's County, Maryland, for example, doing a really, really interesting thing on the financial front on their second schools bundle, where the 10%, first of all, they have set aside 10% minority equity investment opportunity that the umbrella equity investor will backfill in case there's not sufficient demand for that product, but they're also doing crowdfunding. And I think this is all part of the feedback loop. We talk about crowdfunding. It's got to be based on data, of course. What are you investing in and at what level, that kind of thing. But I think this is the type of horizontal communication world that we all live in. It's not this vertical stovepipe anymore that we have to bring to this world to get things done. What is the policy solution we're after here on data? I just want to, because I'm going to build on your point. What is the policy solution we're trying to get at here for reauthorization?
Is that a leading question? Do you have an answer in your mind already, or are we just kind of?
You all are the experts here. I'm asking you.
No, I mean,
what's the data policy solution?
I think it's I think it's enhancing those partnerships and everybody being very transparent and open about what do you want to collect? What is the ultimate goal? What do you want to collect? We have that at our disposal, I think, between us to collect the information that we need to collect, and then how do we get it out there in forums like this, at AASHTO, at National Governors Association and NLCs of the world and things like that, so that we can all be communicating what's best and feeding into. I mean, there were a whole, I don't know, probably a half dozen reports at the end of IIJA that were supposed to come out on these topics, on P3s, on alternative delivery, on data, and all that stuff. Pushing to get those, submitting information so that those reports come out. That'd be nice.
Baruch?
Yeah, I'll give you an impossible
I'm sure you're
answer.
doing that.
Give me a good one. Give us a good one.
You have to find a way to empower your career people and not your politicians. I know, impossible. But the reality is, the reason why many of these reports have not come out is political. Somebody's going to look bad. Some constituency doesn't want to see something. If I'm a DOT, and most DOTs, I mean, Virginia, North Carolina, have project prioritization processes now, so they've taken at least some of the politics out, but there's horse trading there that goes on. So you've got to find a way to structure the agency. I think some of it comes back to maybe FHWA, DOT as a whole needs to be restructured so that there can be less politics in the decision-making process. And I know that's a dreamy, crazy thing to say, but I think we got to try that.
Oh, I don't know. I can add maybe just a conceptual kind of notion to that, and I always come back to this notion that infrastructure is widely seen as bipartisan until it's time to build infrastructure. And then all of the different stakeholders and opposition and everything else comes out. I mean, infrastructure, macro level, Infrastructure Week is huge. There's a lot of momentum. There's
Happy
a lot of
Happy Infrastructure Week, everybody, by the way.
Happy Infrastructure Week to
Happy
everybody.
Infrastructure Week.
But there's a million organizations with a million different perspectives, each trying to get a bit, and then that becomes a microcosm on the ground in the communities that Marshall and Team MDOT and with their public-private partners are trying to improve every step of the way. And there's going to be noise, and noise is tough. And I think that there's a way that through these partnerships you can kind of turn that into music a little bit. And I was just down in Miami a couple weeks ago, so this is on my mind. But one of the things that the team did down in Miami for the tunnel project was went into the community and found folks in like senior homes and in other areas in the community that were going to be impacted by some of the truck traffic coming in and out for the construction, and asked if they wanted jobs as flaggers on that project, and hired them as flaggers, and went out there and put up pop-up tents and had lunch and had music out there for everybody so that the community was involved in delivering the project. And I think that's something that, as a partnership, is just a really good example of how we can kind of do that.
I love the analogy of turn it into music. Honestly, the partnership piece of this, I've always thought of it. I think in the previous panel also touched on this for our engineer colleagues here in the room. Absolutely. Thank you. Absolutely. But it takes all of us. It's the and of the expertise and the views in the room. Question in the back. Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Airport's my favorite subject.
We
My
love
name
airports.
is Cindy. I'm a PhD candidate. My research is enhancing airport resilience through public-private partnerships. I'm creating a financial model and comparative analysis. And I want to say about airports is you're exactly right. When I was looking for a research topic, we have a lot of information on surface projects, not so much airports. And so as we know from the ASCE report card, it was a D- in 21. We've moved it up to a D, and there is still a $111 billion investment deficit with airports for investment, but the GAO since 1998 has always reported an investment gap between planned development and investments. So something really to look at, but more importantly, being part of the P3 Center and being part of the research project for challenge projects, it's institutional capacity. So if, just to say, I have an executive MBA, I have a master's in construction, this PhD in civil. I worked inside airports. I was a maintenance manager and a project manager, construction manager. I just got off of a progressive design build project, which is really complex as well. P3s are highly complex. And I want to thank Dr. Gifford, in helping me through these past, 3-4 years. But if I worked in, public agency who are stewards of our public assets, P3s are highly complex. So it's about the training. And I think that would really open the doors to really help public agencies embrace these P3s so that they are successful, because we just heard in the last panel how not as successful they are, 90.5. We want them to be successful all the time, and they can be, because P3s are very valuable, and especially when we're looking at this deficit. So just wanted to make that comment.
Thank you for the comment. And just to build on that, it's not just P3s that are complex, it's major projects are complex, right? Over whatever million, 100 million, 250 million, 500 million, whatever the TIFIA number is, 750 million, whatever it is. Major projects are complex. And as much as I love to give Dr. Gifford the credit for the statement, think slow, act fast, right? From the very famous book, we all know how big things get done, I think, with the Dutch professor, I think, whatever it is. Terrific book. If you haven't read it, you really should. You really should. But one of his key points in there is to think slow and act fast. One of the criticisms sometimes people say about using an alternative delivery methodology, Tom, as you know, they say, well, it takes too long. Arguably, I like to say we're going to take the amount of time it actually takes. And we're going to build and budget for that and to get it right up front. We think slow, we do the work up front. It takes a little more time, maybe a little more cost and budget to actually study it. But then once we get ready, we've got the team, we're going to act fast, we're going to do this thing well. I like to think that's exactly what we're doing in Maryland and in Virginia. Thoughts? Any other questions, thoughts? Oh, Baruch, did you have something to build on here? And then,
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think that would be a helpful tool for FAA to have. I mean, USDOT has a lot of P3 resources, and I think those have been tremendously helpful. To my knowledge, FAA does not have those resources, which would be a relatively easy thing to do. Oh, and I would also say I think that P3 projects overall have been tremendously successful. If you compare them to, especially even DBs, but design, bid, build, in terms of keeping costs down and opening on time, I don't think it's close.
I mean, I think again, I would argue it's not so much about the model. It's about the best practices and the learning that has happened in this room as a result of the great work in academia and across the country and around the world on the issues focused of risk. And I know at MDOT, we're working very hard to ensure we're trying to get risk right. It's one of the things I put on our website. We're trying to get risk right. And we start from there and trying to recognize, just identify the risk, allocate the risk, the best partner who can handle it, and hopefully that partner will mitigate that risk most appropriately. That wasn't what I was going to talk about here. Anyway, it's challenging, right? This is and there's an art to this. Last questions here. Was there a question? Risk.
With KPMG.
Hi, Jeff.
you talked about, the federal incentives, this really being a table-setting year. And kind of looking at the skinny budget came out the other week, increases for the infra grant program, increases for shipbuilding that, didn't exist before, FAA, and then big decreases in area like DOE and, water infrastructure. Curious how the skinny budget is landing on the Hill, and if you have any insights into kind of what you think the incentives landscape will look like once Congress is kind of done. Are there areas where you think that the skinny budget missed, and you think that Congress will want to expand, or if there are areas that maybe are not going to land as well on the Hill?
We'll start down here. I have my thoughts.
It's a good question. What Congress wants and what the administration wants are always different, even when it's the same party. And so I think you're going to see generally, I think that's in line with what Congress wants, although I don't know about some of the big cuts to, the DOE, we understand some of those things are not the priority of this administration. Others I'm not so sure about. I think there's a little bit of heartburn among some of the senior leadership on the increase in the infra grants, because I don't think that's where they wanted to go. Now, obviously, the infra program is going to be targeted toward different localities, probably rural areas, as opposed to what it was during the Biden years. I think that could be scaled back a little bit. So generally on target, but Congress will do what Congress wants.
Tom? Congress will do what Congress wants. But what does it mean for the people in this room? What does all this mean?
I don't know. I mean, it's starting point right now, and I think you've got the committees working hard on their pretty aggressive timelines for both reconciliation and service reauthorization for next year. There's also permitting. Permitting keeps coming up again and again. And I heard Chairwoman Capito last night speak for about 5 minutes. It's one of the few things that she hits on every time pretty consistently. And there seems to be a momentum and an agreement there on the bipartisan level to do that. And that's something that I think tracks with what the administration's been doing. So there could be some agreement on that front that I think would be welcome news to everybody in this room.
Getting towards the end of our 12:15, Doctor, is that where we're going on this thing? So let's do summarize here. Status quo year, perhaps? I'm trying to think, what are our takeaways here? Great optimism in the P3 market, not just because of the current challenges, but forthcoming challenges. Possible focus on airports, perhaps, from some of the FAA challenges we've seen out there. Private activity bonds, great tool. We'll see if the cap gets raised. The muni bond tax exemption was not touched, I think, in the current draft that came out of, Ways and Means wasn't done, but that's certainly one as well. So a lot of the IRA, Inflation Reduction Act tax credits, to some comments, those could be on the way for potential reductions. What does that mean for our world here? And then what have we not talked about here? For example, Tom, do we need an infrastructure bank? Does the United States need a national infrastructure bank?
We'll just start kind of coming up with some stuff. So the one thing that I didn't touch on was you mentioned the IRA credits. That to the extent that those direct pay credits for the locals continue, and there seems to be momentum that they will. I mean, those are great opportunities if they can structure public-private partnerships to continue to advance some of those energy goals, which are very much needed as we need more and more energy throughout the nation. I think the concept of an infrastructure bank is an interesting one that we've seen kicked around over the last few years. Would have to see what that looks like, what's included, how the private sector can play a role in delivering some of those projects as P3s. You see consistent emphasis in GOP platforms in particular on the policy side to incentivize private sector investment, private sector capital, which obviously we like to see. But how does that translate? Does it translate into an infrastructure bank? Does it translate into more incentives for states within a larger umbrella of state flexibility? I don't know. Those are all things.
What's the policy question? Policy problem we're trying to solve with that too. That's never been clear.
Yeah. So I don't think we need an infrastructure bank. I'm not opposed to one, but I think we have the tools right now to do what we need to do without it. It's been, there's been 27, it seems like, bills introduced over the last 15 years to have an infrastructure bank, and we never seem to get there. So to me, I mean, some of that could be political gridlock, but to me that suggests there's not a big need that we would see. I would also say that I think the permitting reform is critical. We have seen previous administrations attempt and in fact make some reforms, but they just haven't really sped up the project length. It takes us about twice as long to do a project as it does a Western European country, which has got the same kind of environmental review process. So this administration seems super motivated. This Congress seems super motivated. I'm hopeful we get big reforms this time.
Any other final questions in our room today? If not, I'll close with this final entreaty for you out there. I came from the private sector last year, and I've joined MDOT as beginning of the year. I love it. It's cool. And I would encourage everybody in this room, if you have not worked in government before, state government where the owner of the infrastructure actually is, do it. Do it. Government needs you, needs your service, and needs you to contribute. It's a really interesting thing to do, and I encourage everyone to do it if you haven't already. So I leave you with that. Anything else today? Thanks to our panelists and our discussion here.